First speaker on my list is European Union.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The European Union welcomes the report of the Special Rapporteur, Dr. Said, and thanks him for his reporting on the human rights situation of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The report provides comprehensive information on the critical human rights situation, as well as on legislative developments and their implementation. We welcome the positive amendments introduced by the revised 2013 Penal Code and improved protections of the accused in the 2015 Criminal Code, and we strongly encourage full implementation of these improvements. We note with deep concern the highest level of executions in many years, including of juvenile offenders, and especially the high number of cases that do not meet the threshold of more serious crimes under international human rights law. Taking note of Iran's pressed willingness to explore ways to reduce the number of executions, as stated in your report, we urge once again the government to establish a moratorium on the executions with a view to abolishing the death penalty. The European Union finds the widening crackdown on freedom of expression and opinion deeply worrying, and urges the government to consider amending or rescinding laws and policies that contravene freedom of expression online and offline. The European Union also expressed serious concerns at the situation of religious minorities in Iran, in particular the continuing systematic discrimination of persons belonging to the Baha'i community. Furthermore, we call on the government to amend laws that violate the human rights of women or that undermine their equal and full enjoyment of civil, political, social and economic rights. The European Union takes note of the increased engagement of the government with the Special Rapporteur and other special procedure mandate holders, as well as the expressed willingness of the government to engage in a dialogue with the European Union on the human rights situation in Iran, as stated recently by Foreign Minister Zarif before the European Parliament, but calls on the government to facilitate country visits by the Special Rapporteur and other mandate holders. I would like to ask you to hear more views from your side on the situation of human rights defenders in Iran. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I
now give the floor to the distinguished delegation of the Russian Federation. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We have taken note of the report presented to the Council by the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Iran. The experts' approach to examination of the situation in that country is politicized and unconstructive. To take one example, the report analyzes only civil and political rights. Social, economic and cultural rights, on the other hand, are practically ignored. That clearly demonstrates the selectivity in assessment by the Special Rapporteur. Mr. Vice President, as experience shows, assuming the role of a mentor in the human rights field is not justified and does not facilitate improvement of conditions. We are convinced that the international community, instead of seeking to isolate certain states, should seek to involve them in respectful and equitable dialogue on the full range of human rights issues. That is the way, through constructive and non-politicized cooperation, that relations should be built with all states. The confrontational practice of defamation of states on political motives discredits the work of the Council. We would particularly like to point to the constructive stance taken by Tehran to cooperation with the HCR, its mechanisms, and OHCHR, as has been demonstrated several times in practice. Thank you. I thank the delegation of the Russian Federation.
And now I call on delegation of Venezuela.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. The statements made in the Special Rapporteur's report on the Islamic Republic of Iran lead us to reiterate our preference for genuine dialogue and cooperation, the true instruments for the effective promotion and protection of human rights in the world. Once again, we wish to express our rejection vis-à-vis the imposition of specific mandates against countries that do not submit to imperial dictates. This seriously tarnishes the credibility of the human rights system of the United Nations. Iran has shown that it cooperates with this system with very successful results within the framework of the UPR, whose recommendations are accepted and which are implemented. We must adopt a constructive attitude in dealing with the challenges we face in the field of human rights. We must be objective and impartial, as sovereign peoples of the world demand, excluding politicization, selectiveness, and double standards that only fit the mandates of those who are catering to the interests of the promoters of interference. Again, we speak out against the imposition of these mandates against countries and feel that this should be struck from the agenda of this Council. Thank you.
I thank distinguished representative of Venezuela for his statement, and I invite delegation of Germany to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Germany thanks the Special Rapporteur for informing the Human Rights Council on the current situation of human rights in Iran. Germany aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. Mr. Special Rapporteur, we agree that the situation of human rights remains critical. So far, the historic success of the nuclear agreement has not led to any concrete improvements with regards to civil and political rights. Quite the contrary, in the run-up to recent elections, freedom of expression was further restricted. Many journalists were arrested during the last months and are still to face trial for peacefully voicing their opinion. We call upon Iran to immediately release these prisoners and furthermore to respect the Iranian society's bid for political participation by allowing free expression without fear of being prosecuted and by ending non-transparent vetting processes. Despite repeated announcements for legal revision of the death penalty, executions take place at an alarming rate. Last year marked a very sad record. Germany is particularly worried by the ongoing execution of juvenile offenders, which is a clear violation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We urge Iran, in the first step towards complete abolition of the death penalty, to lift all death verdicts handed down to minors, to grant fair new trials in specialized youth courts, and to generally consider alternative punishments as provided for by Iranian law. We call upon the newly elected parliament to swiftly pass alternative legislation. Furthermore, we remind Iran of its international obligation to respect the human rights of all detainees, including their right to fair trial, unrestricted access to lawyers of their own choice, contacts with their families, and humane treatment in prison, including health care. Mr. Special Rapporteur, we share your concern that members of ethnic and religious minorities continue to face discrimination. In particular, members of the Baha'i often have to deal with discrimination in daily life, including closure of businesses, exclusion from public sector jobs in higher education, or prosecution for exercising their civil rights. We call upon Iran to respect its obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and to respect the human rights of all persons in Iran, irrespective of their religious or ethnic affiliations. Mr. Special Rapporteur, in your report you elaborate in detail on recent amendments to the Islamic Penal Code and the Criminal Procedure Code. The reform of the latter in 2013 foresaw the establishment of specialized youth courts. Do you have any information that this has since materialized, and if courts in new trials more often resort to forms of alternative punishment for juvenile offenders? Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
For his statement, and I call on delegation of United States of America.
Thank you. Mr. President, the United States thanks Special Rapporteur Shahid for his strong reports on the situation in Iran and once again calls on Iran to admit him for a country visit. Despite his lack of access, the Special Rapporteur continues to document the bleak human rights record in Iran, and we call for the renewal of the mandate this session. Widespread torture, political imprisonment, lack of fair trial guarantees, harassment of ethnic and religious minorities, and severe restriction on the freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association are among the abuses committed in Iran almost daily. Iran's continued execution of individuals for crimes allegedly committed as juveniles and prolonged arbitrary detention of individuals for the exercise of their human rights and fundamental freedoms are unacceptable. Journalists, artists, ethnic minority advocates, student activists, human rights defenders, and defenders of women's rights are among the individuals who are detained arbitrarily in miserable conditions and often without access to a lawyer and family visitation, in violation of Iran's own laws. We also highlight the continued documentation by the Special Rapporteur of severe restrictions on religious minorities in Iran. Members of the Baha'i, Sunni, and Sufi Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Yarsan, and Zoroastrian religious minority communities face harassment by government officials and are disproportionately sentenced to harsher penalties by courts compared to members of the majority. We extend our gratitude to the Special Rapporteur for his efforts. Dr. Shahid, how can we ensure that the international community remains engaged on the human rights situation in Iran? Thank you.
And I invite the delegation of China to take the floor.
Mr. Vice President, China has noted the report submitted by Mr. Shahid and his presentation just now. China always stands for constructive dialogue and cooperation among states on the basis of equality and mutual respect to jointly seek effective ways to promote and protect human rights and properly handle differences in the human rights field. Without approval from the concerned country to impose on it an external mechanism does not help dialogue, cooperation, or the promotion and protection of human rights. China welcomes the efforts of the Iranian government to promote and protect human rights and understands the challenges facing it. We hope that the international community will look at the human rights situation of Iran in a comprehensive and objective manner, respect its religious and cultural traditions, conduct a dialogue and cooperation with the government so as to play a constructive role in its human rights cause rather than on the contrary. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished delegate from China for her statement, and I call on the delegation of Belarus.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Belarus welcomes the consistent steps taken by Iran to implement the recommendations adopted under the second cycle of the UPR, including amendments to the criminal and criminal procedural legislation. We note the cooperation with the thematic special procedures of the Human Rights Council and the Human Rights Treaty bodies. We are convinced that the constructive and non-politicized dialogue based on the principles of non-selectivity, objectivity, and respect for national sovereignty is the only effective means to ensure human rights universally. Country resolutions and country mandates do not facilitate real progress on human rights. We believe it's counterproductive to examine the situation in Iran outside of the framework of the Universal Periodic Review and see no basis for further extension of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur. Thank you. I thank the distinguished delegate of Belarus for that statement. I now call on the delegation of France. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. France aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union. France thanks Dr. Shahid for his report and welcomes his new efforts to report on the situation with respect to human rights in Iran, despite the prohibition on access to the national territory. France calls once more on the Iranian authorities to cooperate with the Special Rapporteur, whose work is essential to document the real developments in rights and freedoms of Iranians. Mr. Special Rapporteur, once more your report raises our concerns. While the expectations of civil society in Iran are high, the human rights situation remains critical, and the practice of the death penalty in particular is becoming alarming. It comes at the end of trials which do not respect fair, equitable procedures. It also targets minors and people sentenced for acts committed when they were minors, despite international commitments undertaken by Iran. It is applied for a large number of offences, including drugs trafficking, which does not correspond to the threshold of the most severe crimes. France recalls its constant opposition to the death penalty in all places and all circumstances, and reaffirms its determined commitment for the universal abolition of the death penalty. The situation with civil and political freedoms is a matter of great concern, and the progress remains largely short of the expectations of the international community expressed by the General Assembly and the special procedures of the Human Rights Council. All basic freedoms are threatened in Iran. Iran must guarantee freedom of expression, particularly on the internet, freedom of assembly and association, and freedom of religion. Iran must abstain from discriminating against minorities in keeping with its international obligations, such as under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The international community pays particular attention to women as well as the Baha'i community, whose situation is a matter of great concern. Mr. Special Rapporteur, your recommendations are precise and largely addressed to the judicial authorities. France will continue strongly to support your activities and to pass on your messages within its bilateral dialogue and discussions in the European and multilateral format with Iran. Public debate on the death penalty has started in Iran. Certain political leaders have spoken out against application of the death penalty to drugs traffickers, and a draft law is being studied in Parliament on that subject. Mr. Special Rapporteur, according to you, what are the prospects for change in the legislation on the death penalty? Thank you. I thank the distinguished representative of France for that statement, and I now call on Cuba.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. We reiterate our position that the establishment of a special rapporteur to consider the human rights situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran results from a selective and politically motivated effort and not from genuine concern or interest in cooperating with that country in this field. This is why, again, we reiterate we do not support the renewal of the mandate. We'd like to take this opportunity to reiterate our position of principle against resolutions and the establishment of selective mandates against nations of the South, which does not make a contribution to an atmosphere of cooperation and dialogue, which is vital. We will never be a party to repeating in this body what happened in its discredited predecessor, the Commission. Without an approach of genuine cooperation, the Council will not be able to effectively carry out its work of promotion and protection of human rights. Mandates that are imposed on us based on political reasons and double standards without the consentment of the concerned country are doomed to failure. We are convinced that the UPR is the best mechanism to analyze the human rights situation in all countries on an equal basis. And lastly, we wish to reiterate our support to the government and people of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and we support their decision to continue to exercise their right to self-determination and to strive for the full realization of the human rights of its people. We also wish that the proposals of that government to achieve a direct and dialogue and to strengthen cooperation in the fields of human rights be acknowledged as it deserves to be. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba for her statement, and I invite the delegation of Israel to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The State of Israel would like to congratulate the Special Rapporteur for his most valuable report. Israel believes that this report, together with its previous ones, must be a cornerstone for improving the appalling human rights situation in the country. Israel deplores the fact that the Iranian regime continues to violate the most basic human rights of its own population, competing with the utmost inhumane methods that are being used by the notorious ISIL. This year, the Iranian authorities had exceeded all expectations by reaching an amazing peak of hanging one person every 6 hours. Altogether, in 2015, Iran broke a terrifying record of executing 966 persons from its own people, including juvenile offenders. Israel is extremely troubled by the ongoing discrimination of women in Iran in all aspects of life. Laws and draft legislations that violate the basic rights of women, including the rights to freedom of movement, work, and the right to be free from discrimination, should be abolished immediately. Israel is deeply concerned with the continuing discrimination towards religious and ethnic minorities. As the Special Rapporteur demanded, Iran should stop, summon, interrogate and arrest them because of their belief. Iran must stop the destruction of cultural sites of the Baha'i community. And finally, we reject the rosy picture portraying Iran as a shelter for Afghan refugees. As we all know by now, many of them, even young boys, had been coerced by the Revolutionary Guards to fight in Syria. Mr. Vice President, we call the Human Rights Council to continue exposing the severe atrocities that are being carried out in Iran on a daily basis. Israel is convinced that the Iranian people deserve a much more progressive and a humane leadership than Rouhani's oppressing rule. Thank you.
I thank distinguished delegate of Israel for the statement, and I call on delegation of United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The UK welcomes the report of the Special Rapporteur and urges Council members to support the extension of the Special Rapporteur's mandate during this Council session. We remain deeply concerned by the current human rights situation in Iran. In particular, we are concerned about the number of executions referred to in the Special Rapporteur's report, including that during the first 6 months of 2015 saw a record number of executions. We fully support the Special Rapporteur's recommendations that the death penalty not be imposed for crimes committed by juveniles. The UK continues to support the Special Rapporteur's recommendation that the Iranian authorities should immediately commute the death sentences against all political prisoners and prisoners of conscience. We urge Iran to comply with minimum international standards for those countries that have not yet abolished the death penalty. The UK supports freedom of assembly and freedom of expression for all. We agree with the Special Rapporteur's recommendation that non-governmental organisations, including unregistered associations, should be allowed to function freely and their members should be able to operate in a safe environment. The UK joins the Special Rapporteur in calling on the Iranian government to amend laws that violate the rights of women, including their right to freedom of movement, work, and the right to be free of discrimination, especially in the workplace. The UK remains deeply concerned by the treatment of all religious minorities in Iran, including the Baha'i and Christian communities. What more can be done so that the situation in Iran becomes more favourable towards religious minorities in Iran in the short, medium and long term? The UK promotes freedom of speech and access to information. However, the Iranian authorities routinely try to restrict access to uncontrolled information within Iran, as well as attempt to stop information from Iran being sent to the outside world. Mr. Rapporteur, how can we encourage the Iranian government to respect international standards relating to freedom of expression, internet censorship, the harassment and arbitrary arrest of journalists, and freedom of the press? Thank you.
I thank distinguished delegate of United Kingdom for his statement and questions to the Rapporteur, and I call on delegation of Iraq.
Mr. President, my country agrees with the position put forward by the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Syrian Arab Republic and Venezuela on putting an end to this mandate, because it is not the means to genuinely develop the human rights situation in the countries concerned. We are of the opinion that Iran is a country that abides by its commitments and it respects all the conventions and international agreements it has adhered to. We praise its cooperation with the Special Rapporteur within its mandate, and we also commend the elections of the Council of Experts that have recently taken place and its importance in enhancing democracy and human rights and participatory politics. Thank you.
Distinguished delegate of Iraq for the statement, and I call on delegation of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation thanks the Special Rapporteur for the report and welcomes his renewed efforts to report on the human rights situation in Iran. The death penalty in Iran is applied to a large number of offences which fall far outside the category of the most severe crimes. Among people executed are those who were minors at the time of their presumed crime. Switzerland is committed to a campaign for the universal abolition of the death penalty and is very concerned by this situation. Religious and ethnic minorities continue, in law and practice, to suffer violations of their rights. The Baha'i are systematically prevented from getting access to education, to university education, to public sector jobs, and cannot get licenses to carry out professional activity. Despite constitutional guarantees of equality, people belonging to ethnic minorities such as Awazi Arabs, Azeri Turks, Baluch, Kurds and Turkmens continue to meet with many laws and practices that are discriminatory and hinder their access to basic services such as housing, drinking water, employment and education. Hence, Switzerland fully supports the conclusions and recommendations of the Special Rapporteur. In addition, Switzerland notes and welcomes the increased Iranian will to enter into dialogue with various stakeholders in order to speak about relevant issues in the field of human rights. It encourages Iran to continue this path and attain tangible results. Mr. Special Rapporteur, in your view, what are the prospects for a reduction in the large number of executions, particularly for offences that are not considered to be amongst the most serious crimes? Thank you.